Back to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. What is it with some members of Congress and hiding their stock trades? Well, it appears that at least one Republican senator, two Republicans in the House are now under investigation because of a lack of transparency for their stock trades. Here to talk about this is Dave Leventhal. He's the Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for Insider. Dave, you've done some of the reporting on this. Who's involved and what are they accused of?
Well, first of all, you named three of them. There are about 10 different people in Congress who we found this year, and I suspect that there could be more as the year goes on, who have violated a law that was passed about a decade ago called, appropriately enough, the Stock Act. And one of the key provisions of the Stock Act is that if you buy a stock, if you trade a stock, you're on the clock for 45 days to disclose that stock publicly so that you, me, and everyone else can see it. And a number of members of Congress have tripped up on this law, and it's Pat Fallon, congressman from Texas. It's Blake Moore, congressman from Utah. Tommy Tuberville, senator from Alabama, are the three Republicans that you cited, but also Democrat Tom Malinowski from New Jersey, Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, and several others who just simply, for one reason or another, have not been able to get this right.
And what are some of the reasons that they give?
A lot of them will say, well, I have an arm's length relationship with my own money, and I have a financial advisor who does my trades. That may be all fine and good, but the law really doesn't care. The law says that regardless of who's doing the trading, it's a member of Congress who themselves is on the hook to make sure that they are complying with that disclosure provision of the Stock Act. And if they don't, they could be subject to a penalty, an investigation. If it's serious enough, it could go beyond that. And the one thing to note is that the penalty, at least for initial violators, even if it's a huge amount of stock that they're not disclosing on time, is only $200. So it's a bit of a slap on the wrist. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, for example, has been one of the members of the House and the Senate in her case, who said these penalties are not enough. We should not even allow lawmakers to be trading individual stocks. So there's a kind of a curious debate going on intramurally within Congress as to whether this should even be legal in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, a $200 slap on the wrist really is tiny when you consider that some of these transactions were in the millions of dollars, right?
Yeah, millions, even tens of millions of dollars. So in some cases, we're talking a relatively small amount of money, maybe a few $1,000s, a few tens of thousands of dollars. But yeah, we easily get into the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars with some of these trades. And somebody might ask, well, why does this matter? Who really cares? If they're late making a stock disclosure when they're trading, if they disclose it 6 months after the fact instead of 45 days, is the public really hurt by that? Should anyone care? I would point out that we found, at least in some of these stock trades, that they involve companies. For example, in the case of Representative Blake Moore from Utah, he sits on the House Armed Services Committee, okay? And he's trading Raytheon stock. Raytheon is a huge defense contractor. So you have companies that are going before committees, they are going before Congress, they are fighting for government contracts, they are sometimes spending themselves hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to lobby members of Congress and other aspects of the federal government. And then you have the lawmakers who sometimes are privy to information that the general public might not be about industries in general or even companies specifically. So there's a whole lot of interplay, financial intertwining that goes on with these companies and the members of Congress, which is kind of speaks to the point of the Stock Act in the first place, that this should be transparent, that these transactions should be public, and that the public should have very quick access to this information so that it's not a year or two after the fact when it's being made. Very important when, for example, a pandemic happens and you might have lawmakers trading lots of stocks that are pandemic sensitive. We did see a lot of that. Lawmakers have bought Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer and Moderna stock and cleaning companies and you name it, stocks that were definitely being affected and continue to be by the twists and the turns of the markets as the pandemic evolves.
I'm so glad that you mentioned the beginning of the pandemic and some of those stock trades and investments that were made by some members of the US Senate after they received intelligence briefings that were available to them, but not the public. What ended up happening is some of those members of Congress who were caught essentially buying or selling stock based on pandemic information that they got early on?
Yeah, and there were several who were in not only the crosshairs of ethics officials within Congress, but the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It became a criminal investigation, or potentially therefore. And Richard Burr of North Carolina got caught up on this. David Perdue, the former senator from Georgia. Kelly Loeffler, another former senator now from Georgia, was also under a cloud. And then Tom Malinowski, who we reported earlier this year, made a flurry of trades during the beginning of the pandemic and early 2020. He didn't disclose any of the stock trades that he made. He chalked that up to, again, financial advisors, so that it was more of a technical matter. But lawmakers, they have to go through ethics training. It's not like this is some obscure thing that they've never heard about. And this stuff was all in the news when it was happening, especially with the investigations that you mentioned around the pandemic that ultimately didn't lead anywhere to criminal charges, but were definitely pretty serious matters. You can argue whether there should have been charges or not. Ultimately, that did not come to pass. But the point is, if lawmakers are just simply hiding these transactions or not making these disclosures, whether it's on purpose or not, the public can't judge for themselves whether there's a potential conflict of interest here. The public can't judge for itself whether their member of Congress or any member of Congress is doing the right thing.
Now, it's interesting you mentioned that there's a push by Senator Warren and others to make it essentially illegal for members of Congress to engage in these stock trades at all. There's the other argument, though, that, well, you know what, if we just enforce the transparency, then we can have the punishment be, say, what John Ossoff managed to do in Georgia to his Georgia opponent. I believe it was Senator Perdue, where he made this essential theme of the campaign that Perdue was there involved in insider trading based on the pandemic, and Perdue paid the ultimate political price. He lost the Senate race. Right. Is that enough in your estimation to just have the transparency, and as long as people are aware of it, that's fine?
Well, that was the argument about 10 years ago when the Stock Act was passed. Congress passed it. They make their own rules when it comes to matters such as this. It's like two football teams coming together and not having referees and just saying, all right, well, we're gonna call our own fouls. That's effectively what they do here. But yeah, there can be a political price to pay. And the argument back then was that this would just kind of take care of itself. If there was a robust transparency aspect to all of this, everyone would see what everyone else is doing. If somebody was doing something wrong, opponents could pick up on it in a political context, use it in campaign commercials, talk about it on the trail. But what we're seeing right now, especially this year, is that numerous members of Congress are just simply not adhering to those transparency and disclosure positions and provisions. So if everyone isn't playing by the same set of rules or not playing by them in the same way as other people, then you have some people who have an advantage over other people potentially. So the transparency regime, if you will, is sort of breaking down a little bit in ways that might be surprising to people had we been having this conversation 10 years ago.
And for people who want more than transparency, they would describe this as just outright corruption. That if a member of Congress has access to be based on their committees or inside information about a company, how is it possible that they could therefore be profiting off of that through the stock market? How widespread, Dave, are you seeing is this in members of Congress? I mean, I know there's a lot of pressure, financial pressure on some members of Congress who come to Washington with not great financial means. There are others who are like, it's not a big deal, but is it very widespread?
Well, you have a whole mixed bag of approaches that members of Congress take to their own personal finances. You have some members of Congress who just swear off this activity altogether, Democrats and Republicans, who just don't trade individual stocks. They either put it in very conservative funds, bond funds, cash funds, money market, or they'll have exchange traded funds or mutual funds that they use, retirement accounts. Pretty generic stuff. And that stuff doesn't even have to be disclosed on a rolling basis like individual stocks do. But you have plenty of other members, dozens and dozens of members who absolutely do trade and sometimes day trade in stocks of companies that, again, have lots and lots of business before the very federal government that the members of Congress are a part of.
What do you see happening in terms of possibly an effort to tighten the legislation or to close some of the loopholes, as Senator Warren and others might describe it?
Yeah, well, there's already a bill that's been filed this year. I would expect that Elizabeth Warren, based on what she's told us, and Premier Jayapal, the representative from the state of Washington, another Democrat, They're telling us that they're going to file legislation later this year. So it's definitely something that absolutely could be in the debate. Of course, it's competing with many, many other issues, David. And we've got COVID, we've got infrastructure, we've got budgetary matters. So it's not going to likely rise to the top of the heap in terms of priorities in Congress, but it is getting a heck of a lot more attention than it has been, this issue of members of Congress and their stock trades, especially because so many people have been violating the rules in the way and in the manner in which they have.
What's been the reaction from, you mentioned some of the members of Congress who just don't engage in stock trades at all. They must be pretty upset when they see some of their fellow colleagues who are doing this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, they're rather muted in terms of any criticism, but they basically say, well, the easiest way to avoid this is to not engage in the activity in the first place. You can't break a rule that doesn't apply to you. So that's been really more or less the philosophical approach that they've taken to this.
Where do you see this going? You mentioned there's some legislation under consideration. Does it get pushed out, pushed aside because there's so many other priorities, or is there actual action that you envision being taken?
It's been tried before, and it really hasn't just risen to the top in previous congressional cycles. So I would expect that it gets debated. Elizabeth Warren sits on the Senate Finance Committee, and she probably has a much greater standing this time around than she did before when she was in the minority. Democrats have control over the Senate, at least for now. So as a result, it may get more attention. Still pretty dubious as to whether it would actually pass and get to Joe Biden's desk at this point.
Interesting stuff. Dave Leventhal, he's the Deputy Bureau Chief for Insider in Washington. Dave, thanks for doing this. We appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for watching the Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.